As one enters 2024 and considers any possible new collecting challenges for the year, one thing that came to my mind a few days ago was my love of these paperbacks published by Panther in the late 60s and early 70s with this symbol here. Now, as you know, I'm very big on terminology, and I decided they needed something to set them apart from the other Panthers, because Panther has a long history as an SF imprint. And I decided to call this flattened sphere an oblate. The oblate is a geometrical term for a flattened sphere, and I'm sure somebody who really knows geometry will tell me off and say it's just an oval, Steve, but I'm calling it the Panther Oblate simply because it has mythic resonance. I like the word, and you know, they're very beautiful books, so let's use beautiful language. And you know me, I normally like to be as correct as possible, but in this case I'm sort of calling upon poetic license to go with this. And as you see, here we have three very beautiful books in a white livery and Panther science fiction there at the top. Now this is a bit of a collaborative video because I was talking to Jules Burt the other day, as we often are, and he was talking about his frustration with publishers failing to sort of pick up on opportunities to create series for people to collect. And then, you know, sometimes they do that and sometimes they fail spectacularly. And both of us in our times as booksellers would spend time saying to publishers, sales reps, you know, why don't you sort of do this? Why don't you do that? Particularly sort of paperback ones. And they don't really sort of bother very much. So really, one has to often look to the past for collecting challenges. And this is not going to be a collecting challenge for me, but I mentioned to Jules that it was quite sort of inconsistent in terms of the use of this by Panther during a certain period, which is quickly identifiable by using a source like Internet Science Fiction Database, ISFDB, as sort of coming up about 67 and finishing by about 72, except if you watch the video that Jules has made on this subject, which I'll link to, and you'll see a much bigger collection of books, because he tends to collect by publisher, I tend to collect by author, though we both sort of go back and forth over those divides. You will see that he found Panther Oblates as late as 1976. I'm just going to go through a few of mine and talk about the books and talk about why I think it was used and wasn't used. And the thing to remember, of course, is that publishing now and since the dawn of the computer has been more consistent in terms of creating book jackets and liveries and what have you, and consistency. And you'll remember my term, the pan lozenge, which I coined back in about 2006, 2007, and used it in conversations with friends. And my use of that term in a video I made about a year and a half ago has led to other people using the term, making their own videos and collecting the pan lozenge. If you don't know what the pan lozenge is, look it up on the channel, you'll see it there. And people notice straight away when trying to collate lists of what came out in that particular publisher livery, that it was inconsistent in terms of design. And this is very much the case in that period, in the sort of 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and things start to get a lot more standardized in the 80s. And that's of course because computers start to be used. Publishers would have templates for their typography and what have you. So certain elements, like for example an oblate, a legend like that, things on the spine, the colophon, what have you, would all be more consistent. But back in the day, when computers weren't in such use and artwork was done by hand and photography, then it was a different story. So first of all here, you'll see these are all white, and I think if they had gone with entirely white livery on all of these, and of course at this time in the late 60s, early 70s, Penguin were very fixated on black. Their SF was always black, rather like their black classics. And I think if Panther had entirely gone with this white, I'd have gone for it. And this is one I bought recently purely because I love the cover of it. And sometimes they're hard to find a good nick. And this, of course, is The Caves of Steel, which is the first of the Asimov robot books. Now, you can say, oh, iRobot, but iRobot is a collection of short stories. This is a novel. This is the first robot novel. And this, for me, is where Asimov really steps up and starts to become more like a real writer. And it's a great detective story set in the future, and it covers overpopulation, logic problems, artificial intelligence. And I only actually read this a few years ago because I'd always stumbled and fell in my reading of Asimov because I'd focused on the early stuff, on the iRobot stories, on the foundation things, and you know, as I've said before on the channel, I find his style then quite clunky and not very literary and not much fun to read, but by this point he'd stepped up quite a bit, and this is from the early 50s, so this is a late 60s reprint, of course, and very beautiful. And you notice the iconography. The iconography is what really draws me to book covers, and that's what gets people into the vinyl record. It's the iconography of it. Look at what iconography means and you'll understand. It's the sort of whole way the feel of the period and the thing itself is reflected in the design standard. You'll notice here that there are no capitals, there's no uppercase at all, it's all lowercase. Panther Science Fiction. Asimov is like a brand, it's a statement, there's no Isaac, you know, it's just saying this guy is so famous, he's so important as an SF writer, we just refer to him by his surname. And this is an interesting analogue with textbooks, because when I worked in textbooks, it was an interesting thing, because I couldn't understand why people in academic bookselling and campus bookselling referred to books by their author names, not their titles, because that's the opposite generally of what you do in terms of general bookselling. When I went into working in it and I realized that the bookshop I was running, we had 4 different books called biochemistry for 4 different courses recommended by 4 different lecturers. You couldn't just call them biochemistry, you had to call them by the author names. It was Voet and Voet, or I've forgotten lots of the others, what they were. So you see here, interesting, the inconsistency comes to you straight away, because in these slightly later ones, you've got uppercase being used, you've got lowercase there with Alpha Legendary. So it's that whole thing where there isn't sort of grammatic and consistency across things. And you'll notice here that what we have is The Rose by Charles L. Harness, which is a book which was very influential of the New Wave movement. Michael Moorcock was very keen on The Rose, and he, I think, was instrumental in getting compact books, Robertson Vintner, to reprint it when New Worlds was bought by Robertson Vintner, and they wanted to sort of raise their game and stop being seen as a girly book publisher. So they bought Science Fantasy, which was then retitled Impulse shortly after that, and New Worlds as well, and they were in paperback formats. They were digests as such. Jules describes them as digests. I would say if it's an A format paperback, it doesn't really count as a digest. I guess it does in terms of being a magazine, but it's not strictly speaking digest size. A digest is a slightly different size. So I think I would call a sort of point of discussion there, Mr. Burt, on that one. This is a later version of The Rose from Granada. And Granada and Panther are effectively the same thing. We'll come on to that later. And this was the first version I read, and this dates from the sort of early 80s. And I read it purely because Michael Moorcock used to talk about it. And in this book, there's a novella called The Rose and some short stories. Harness didn't produce very much. He was highly acclaimed. Brian Aldiss was a big fan, wrote very beautifully. And this is about art. I won't tell you any more than that. So at one point I had the compact edition as well, which I passed on to my friend Nick, and I wish I kept it because compact books are beautiful. And they're the one early 60s SF imprint that I would consider collecting. And if you watch Jules' recent video about compact, it's very beautiful. Another one I bought fairly recently was this copy of The World Jones Made by Philip K. Dick, and I absolutely love the cover of this. And The World Jones Made is an early PKD novel. It's not one of the more successful ones. I've read it 2 or 3 times. It's one about precognition, and he hasn't sort of quite worked out how that is going to work, and it's falters a little bit plot-wise, but it's a great book and absolutely fantastic jacket. Look at that, brilliant, lovely. So I think if Panther had gone with the Oblate and had gone entirely with the white, I would have been up for it. So I'm going to show you some more just to show you that they were inconsistent in this period. And in Jules' video, you'll see a lot more of that sort of difference and how they used it, not just their SF, but across the board, and how so different it is to these days when everything looks the same. Then it was slightly chaotic, which has a kind of charm of its own. Just to talk a little bit about Panther and the whole confusion around, you'll see Panther books in different periods. And this was my very first copy of Duan's Stream of Electric Sheep, which I finally bagged. I bought this, I think, late 76, early 77, and on the spine it says Panther Granada. And you'll see this is a slightly earlier edition, which is just Panther from the earlier in the 70s. And you'll notice this doesn't have an oblate on it, and this Tom Dish, which is also from the early 70s. You'll see this is late 60s, early 70s, 5 shillings, 25p. The decimal currency came in the UK in February 1971. This echo around his bones. And I know I've banged on about Dish recently, but you'll have to get used to it because it's going to happen a lot this year. But just to sort of talk about Panther and how Panther became Granada and later on Grafton and the whole history of things. Now, something that fascinated me was that a lot of Michael Moorcock's early works, Jack Vance's things, were in Mayflower. And Mayflower was an imprint that was owned by the American publisher Dell. And if you pick up sort of Vance's and Moorcock's from the early 70s, you'll see they have Mayflower on them. And I was always thinking, well, how did Mayflower become part of this whole thing? And Dell owned Mayflower. Now, Granada was an entertainment company that was around from the 1930s, involved in the theatre and cinema. And they got into books in 1968 because they bought Mayflower, they bought Panther, which had been going since the 50s, and they bought Paladin, which was the original B format imprint. And they bought those about 68. Mayflower was later, they didn't acquire Mayflower till the mid-70s. And Granada got into books, which is why you see Granada on the spines of a lot of later things, like, for example, that there. And yet it still says, so you notice there it says Granada science fiction rather than Panther science fiction, and it's gone. But there are examples where you'll see Panther science fiction going right up into the 80s. Like, for example, a lot of the PKDs in this livery, which I bought new, still have Panther on them, even if I bought them in the early 80s. What you'll also see in the 70s and early 80s is that some of the Granada books will have, so they'll have Panther science fiction on the front, Granada on the spine, and sometimes they'll say Triad. And Triad is an indicator of a deal that Granada did with the hardcover publishers Bodley Head, Chato and Cape, who were independent, but they had associations going back quite a long time, and they eventually got swallowed up by Random House. And if you saw Triad, it meant that those books in the Triad quasi-imprint within Granada or Panther came originally from those hardcover publishers, so they were licensed. So that sort of cleared that up. And then in 1983, William Collins acquired Granada. They bought Granada and they altered the name of the imprint from Granada to Grafton in 85, 86. Now, some reference sources say that happens in 83. It doesn't. I know because I was working in bookselling and I was there. And I recall the transition very, very well. And that was 85, 86. It was late 85 and into 86 when that happened. Just looking at these two anthologies, which have the oblate there in different colours, you'll notice the influence that Penguin had over things at that point as well. Because again, dark covers, there was a lot of abstraction, a lot of darkness, a certain amount of psychedelia. And that's very much the thing in the design aesthetic of that time, which is why I personally wish they'd gone with the white. And looking across the different things that they did, there's incredible inconsistency, as I say, and that in some ways makes it interesting. But it also makes it frustrating for the collector who's looking for consistency. But if you're interested in the history of the publishing, it's a fascinating thing that shows how different it was then to the corporate times we live in now, where design is so standardized, the books look almost exactly the same. Different books aimed at the same market will have near identical jackets and they'll be slathered in text all over them. If you go in a bookshop now and look at a lot of new books, they are covered in text. There's loads of quotations from reviews and what have you, trying to get you to buy them. Whereas back in the day, books kind of stood on their own and you relied entirely on the artwork. And I think maybe was it the fact that the readers were more engaged, they were reading more reviews themselves? Who knows? The media was smaller and less hot. So maybe bookie people were more up on reading the newspapers, reading reviews, magazines. So they didn't need that stuff slathered all over the jackets. Who knows? These are some books you'll see in Jules's video, and he's got a very, very nice copy of Pavan there, and I've had this one for years as well. And you'll notice that the colour leaches through from the back, both here and on the inner wheel. And Pavan, of course, is a very famous book. It was in Anthony Burgess's 99 novels. And recently on BookTube, I've seen more and more people are picking up and reading it. I'm yet to see many people going beyond that. I talked Jules into reading the Furies first. I talked Richard Rempel at Vintage SF into reading the Furies. He didn't like it, but he loved Pavan, so maybe he's going to go back to that, he said. And I would say, you know, Roberts is kind of essential for anybody who's serious about their science fiction reading. The Inner Wheel is Keith's, let me see, his third novel. And it's got certain sort of similarities to, say, More Than Human and some of the works of John Wyndham. It's a Gestalt entity sci novel, and it's not one of his major works, but I do like it. And at one point I did have a signed first, a Doubleday sign first, and I sold it on. It just sort of shows you really, but I have got the UK first now. And again, you'll see the constant presence of Panther science fiction across these, also on this Tom Dish, which I've shown half a dozen times here recently. But that's to show you the different ways that, you know, the jackets weren't uniform in the art style either. It was whatever suited the book. And this one for Pavan suits it really, really well, being an alternative history, of course. And this came up recently in a video where somebody was talking about steampunk, and this isn't steampunk. Yes, you know, that's a steam-driven traction engine, but it's not steampunk. Steampunk doesn't happen until the 1980s, and we'll talk about that in another video. The way that a lot of terminology is sort of slathered across from one thing to another does rather sort of, it doesn't really get to me really. I don't think it's very helpful when it's not very specific in terms of the history of the genre. You know, it's okay having a poetic description. I think I'm letting myself out of the back door here, I know, but sort of just applying sort of sub-genre terms willy-nilly doesn't really cut it with me, I'm afraid. It's just one of those things. And you'll notice on this Roberts that it's got this wraparound artwork, which is really nice. It's a nice addition to get. And of course, early UK editions of Pavan don't include the white boat. That first popped up in a US edition. And I have to say, I don't think the white boat is that important compared to the rest of the stories. I think it's rather out of kilter. So I'm quite happy to read it without the white boat. And I've read it in both versions, of course. One book that Jules will show you in his video is a book called The Thirst Quenchers by Raphael, which is in the Oblate, and I don't have it. And here's an example of another book which is in the Oblate, and I'll flash the Oblate version up on the screen. This is an 80s reprint. This is Code 3 by Raphael, and Jules saying he didn't really know anything about Raphael. And this is Raphael's most famous book. And as it says on the front here, before Mad Max, there was Code 3. And yeah, Code 3, of course, is American police chat for something like a major incident on the roads. I'm sure somebody who's up on these things will tell me. But this is a nice little book, actually. And Raphael sometimes gets compared to Heinlein. He's in that sort of school. And it's just about motorway cops in the future. And it's got a strong central character. There's a woman who's a strong central character, and I think she's a Native American from what I recall. And, you know, this is a fun read. I wouldn't rave about it, but it's certainly a fun read. And, you know, say this is Granada. So interestingly, of course, this is a book which appeared in the 60s. And what you notice when you're collecting what would now be vintage SF from the 60s onwards is that many books were reprinted many times. And something that Jules shows in his video, he shows a copy of Lord Tiger by Philip Jose Farmer from about 73-74, and I've got one with the same cover. Now mine is a much later Granada edition because I bought it in the 80s new, and this is why I'm showing you a rather small number of books in this video, because when I entered the bookselling, and I've been a serious SF reader for some time before that, I was buying the sort of books which were in Panther Granada. I was buying them new because they were still in print. They were reprinted regularly. Philip K. Dick, Kurt Vonnegut, Ray Bradbury, all these people, Philip Jose Farmer. So I have a lot of the books that you will see in Jules's video, but I still have my original copies that I bought new because I was buying them and reading them intensely at that time. And as a bookseller who was focusing on SF, something that was a big thing for me when I was buying and stocking my SF section was very much the thing that you would work from catalogs. You didn't work from computers, you worked from catalogs. And while I'm doing this, I'm just sort of creeping a few other bits and pieces in. There's a Robert F. Young, there's somebody you don't hear much about these days, and Lindsay Getteridge. Again, it's got the Oblate there and a green one there. And I work from catalogs. So when you're building a science fiction section back in those days before you had a computer, you would work from catalogs, stock lists you call them, and they would be reissued by the publishers every month and updated with the new books. So you'd go to your section and you would check off what you had, what you didn't have, what you wanted. You would write in next to the book the quantity you wanted, put a ring around it, and then pop it in the post to the publisher. You could do a thing called teleorder me. You type it into a keyboard and it would down the modem of your phone line to do that as well. But more often than not, it was quicker to just, you know, fill out a catalogue and let them do the work. So you built it up, and the first catalogue I would always go to, say once a week maybe, when I was looking at my SF section, it would very much be you would go to the Granada Grafton catalogue first because it had the best and biggest SF range. It was the core of things more than anything. This is before it became Voyager. It was very much the catalogue that had all the essential stuff you needed. It had Asimov, Bradbury, Vonnegut, Moorcock, you know, or Farmer, all these sort of people who are the bedrock of your sort of section for SF, very much so. So from its inception in the 1950s right the way through until the imprint identity finally sort of vanished away into Grafton in the sort of mid to late 80s, Panther was a really key thing. And, you know, the books have a real iconic power. And here's some all with your Oblate in its different variations here. A bit of new wave here now. And of course, the thing is with a lot of these books, the new wave books are really sort of seminal and central to Panther because they were what was happening at the time. Moorcock was editing Best of New Worlds for Panther, which by then had been going for a long time, and there were lots of anthologies. And, you know, the new wave very much was the cutting edge. And the 60s was a funny time because it was the time when people were first really becoming aware in a really mass sense in the UK of the great SF from the golden age, and they're being reprinted and reprinted. And if you talk to a paperback dealer like, say, Morris Asados, he will tell you that what's hard to find is 90s paperbacks, because of course a lot of them never caught on. They only had one printing, whereas a lot of things from the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s had multiple printings because they caught on. Was it that they were better? Was it that they were more groundbreaking? I would say that the weight of history is with them, and even though obviously there's great stuff published after the 80s, I think science fiction had really slowed down in terms of its evolutionary and revolutionary development. Just looking at these new wave books here, this is typical of the way that Ballard was marketed in those days. He was always referring to surrealist painters in his work, and this of course is a Max Ernst, and very beautiful. And the hardcover, the Cape hardcover, has a jacket very like this, and that's one of the few original Ballard firsts I don't have. So I have been picking up these paperback ones, and they're getting more expensive. They're very beautiful. This is one of the most beautiful ones, Disaster Area. Fantastic stuff. Look at that, absolutely gorgeous. And again, that white I think is really strong. And here's somebody strongly associated with New Wave, Charles Platt. He was one of the contributors to New Worlds, and he was editor when Moorcock sort of got tired. By that point, New Worlds had moved on to Sphere as an A format paperback, and then briefly to Corgi. And at that stage, Charles Platt and then Hilary Bailey were editing, and Charles had done a lot of work on it. And this is The Garbage World, which is one of his fantastic little SF novels. I really like his stuff. Great, marvelous. So there are a few of those. Let's see what happened when the livery changed. So here are some Panthers from just after the period when the Oblate stopped being such a thing, round about 72. And here's Asimov, Nightfall 1 and Nightfall 2. Really like these covers, fantastic, really great. They're originally on the same book, of course. And here's a late one from 74, and as Jules said, Jules has got the Ballard ones. He's got one of Concrete Island, which I think is from 76. And those sort of later Panther ballads are really hard to find in good nick, and you never see them. So if you do see them, snap them up. He's got some lovely ones. I've got them all pretty much in hardcover first. Once you get to about 1970, from that point on, I've got all the Ballard hardcover first. Mostly bought them as they came out in the 80s and then backtracked. So this is Breakfast of Champions, Kurt Vonnegut, and this is a, let me see, this is a 74 reprint, and you can see it's got the Oblate there. So it used to come up now and again, so that shows the wonderful inconsistency that it used to have in those days. So maybe that's something you want to look at yourself. To say, check out Jules's video, which is very comprehensive and professional as ever. You'll love it. And he shows lots and lots of covers, and you see how it was applied inconsistently. There's also a great video on his channel about Panther SF per se. I'll do one myself one day because I've got a heck of a lot of it, as I say, and try and talk to you a bit more about my reading experience and my relationship with that imprint, which is sort of very deep back in the 80s particularly. And yeah, maybe you want to look at ISFDB and watch out for the Oblate, and you'll find it very interesting seeing how it's inconsistently applied, and it sort of really conjures up the more anarchic spirit of those times. Hope you enjoyed that. Another video up again soon. There'll be reviews coming up. Thanks for watching. Subscribe, like, all that stuff, and bye for now. And I really wish they'd gone with the white throughout, because this is the Joker in the pack, beautiful as it is.